So I'd like to thank you all for being here for the Bereavement Network of Hawaii quarterly training. And today we're very excited to present Dr. Bob Baugher, who is here with us. We had the opportunity to meet Dr. Baugher at the Compassionate Friends conference back in March of this past year here in Hawaii. And Dr. Baugher, I'll give you his bio now. He was very gracious to agree to come and be with us at a class that we have at the University of Hawaii, and now also to talk today for our Bereavement Network of Hawaii group. Bob Baugher, PhD, FT, is a psychology professor at Highline College in Des Moines, Washington, where he teaches courses in psychology and death education. As a trainer for Living Works, he has trained more than 1,500 people in suicide intervention. Dr. Baugher has written books and articles on grief and loss and has given more than 800 workshops across America, England, South Africa, Namibia, Australia, Singapore, Canada, and the Philippines. He is the professional advisor for both the Seattle Widowed Support Group, Widows Information and Consultation Service, and the South King County chapter of the Compassionate Friends. Today for our training, we've asked him to talk on two topics that is given at the Compassionate Friends Conference in his death education classes. So I'd like for you to welcome Dr. Bob Baugher. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Baugher. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great, thank you. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the group for inviting me today, especially because they sent me a list of, Alan and Louisa sent me a list of organizations in the area. And it's quite impressive. I went through all these and looked at all these people who are helping others involved in grief and loss and so on. And I really want to acknowledge those folks. Also, I want to show everybody where I am right now. It's going to be a little tough to see at first, but yes, I'm right up here on the 30th floor of the Tapa Tower with in my kids' room on the 30th floor. So we are, we just got through coming out of the ocean about 45 minutes ago. So yes, it's my vacation, but I also love doing this. So so welcome everyone. So today we got two topics that we're going to deal with. First, we're going to talk about coping with guilt, because as you might guess, that's a huge area. As Alan mentioned, I'm involved with both the Widows Group and the Compassionate Friends Group, the group that supports bereaved parents. I've been the professional advisor for both of them for a number of years. And so a lot of what I've taught and the workshops that I've given have to do with the fact that I am a teacher and I take in information. And so my mentors have been people who themselves have gone through grief and loss and so on. So in talking about, let me show you, okay. The people who I can see, will you nod your head if you can see this okay? Okay, good. All right, so this is, I'm gonna give a shorter version of the talk that I gave last night to Alan and Louisa's class, which is coping with guilt and loss, and especially with parents. That is one of the main features of what happens when someone experiences the death of a child, and that is that they end up having guilt in all kinds of, different areas. So let's see if I can page down here. Let's see what I can do. So one of the things that I always say at the beginning of a guilt workshop, and when I give these workshops to parents at the National Conference for Compassionate Friends, they are, we're talking about 60, 70, 100 people show up at the guilt workshop because it's such a huge issue. And so one of the first things I say to them, as it says there, is that guilt is a feeling, okay? That you can't talk people out of guilt. like I did with the class last night, if I turned to you right now and you said something to somebody like, I'm really feeling guilty. And then the person said to you, well, you shouldn't feel guilty. Would you go, oh, okay, I guess I feel better, right? Well, obviously that's not how it works. And so I say to the parents as I'm standing in front of them, I'm not going to tell you not to feel guilty. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at guilt from a variety of perspectives. And so let's see, why am I having a problem paging down here? Let's see if this is going to work. No. So anyway, let's talk about some guilt statements, and then I'll figure out how to page down here. And one of them is, the if onlys. Another one is why didn't I? And the I should have's. And this is payment for all the terrible things that I've done and so on. I came up with like 12, 14 different types of guilt. So let's look at them here. So you see them listed there, death causation guilt. And one of the things that happens is that it doesn't matter how that person died. If you perceive that you had any indication, role in it or whatever, you feel that you contributed to the death. The example I gave last night was a man who was in his garage pouring some chemicals from his yard. His three-year-old son was standing there and said to the child, don't touch that. I'll be right back. And he came back, 30 seconds later, and his son had already taken some in, and his son died. Now, here's an example of death causation guilt where someone actually did something that, resulted directly in that person's death. The other extreme is a mom that I had years ago whose son died in a freeway accident in which a truck hit him. And just before he turned to her and said, "Bye, Mom." And she said, "Bye." And 15 minutes later, she got a message that he was in the hospital and then that he had died. And she felt guilty that if she had said maybe something like, "Be careful," maybe he would have seen that truck coming. Or, "I love you." And that might have delayed him for 2 seconds. And then he might have, not been hit. Do you understand? Both these people had death causation guilt. And it didn't matter to what extent they were involved in it. The important thing is that they felt guilty. And then another one is illness-related guilt, or moment of death guilt, is that, I didn't do enough while they were ill, or I wasn't there when they died. I arrived too late. What kind of person am I? And then failure of what's called role guilt. I wasn't a good enough parent. I wasn't a good enough brother or sister. I wasn't a good enough husband or wife. And it's so easy, when anything occurs, that our brain goes back to it and we think about it again and again and we roll it over and over. I was telling the class last night that, of course, like Louisa and Alan teaching a class on death, you get students coming in and talking to you about, the kinds of things that they've gone through. And one of the big questions that comes up is, they say to me, "Dr. Bob, I'm thinking about this thing over and over and over again. How can I stop it? When am I going to stop it?" And I say to them, your brain is going to have to go over and over and over 1,000,000 times or more until it finally decides it doesn't need to think about it so much anymore, because we know we can't control our thoughts. And as opposed to say, don't think about this, or don't feel guilty, or, don't go there, it's not going to work. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about, as it says here, suggestions for coping. Then another one is moral guilt, that God did this to me, or spirit did it, or I wasn't a good enough person, or I did these terrible things. And here, the result is that now this terrible thing has happened and somehow I feel guilty. I gave an example last night to the students of, let's say we have a 14-year-old girl who decides that she's going to engage in masturbation, right? And yet her background is, I shouldn't be doing this. And then, a week later or a year later, her brother dies, right? What does she have? Moral guilt. I did this terrible thing, and then my brother died. And one of the things that, I always emphasized, I teach a class on death, as Ellen mentioned. And one of the things I say to my students when we talk about children and death is that, teenagers are very smart. You know, they know things, but they also have a lot of superstitious behaviors, that I did this thing over here, and then this thing over here happened, and maybe somehow this thing caused this thing to happen. And so what happens is, you know, they're walking around with this, you know, this sense of guilt that they may be, you know, reluctant or embarrassed to talk to other people about. And then there's if only guilt, that, you know, you just replay that over and over again. If only I'd done that, if only I had said this or hadn't said this. And then another one is unmentionable guilt. And as I said last night to Ellen and Lisa's students, I said, I hope you're going to be the kind of person who's going to be this good listener, who's going to be able to establish rapport, who's going to be able to sit down with a person, and they may tell you something that they've never told anyone before. And it may be this unmentionable guilt, is that I said these terrible things, or especially with children, just their thoughts, right? I hated my brother and then he died, right? I was mad at my father because he's the one who always punished me. One of my students made a note of that, her father died in a car accident, and, you know, she looked back on saying to herself, you know, when she was punished, especially, I wish he were dead, and, you know, I wish he were gone. And so these thoughts, you know, of a 6, 7-year-old can, you know, result in this unmentionable guilt. Okay. And then pain to others guilt. I mentioned that I have a website that I'll show you at the top of the page here. It's basically www.baugher.com. And I have more than 100 articles that I've written over the years on coping with grief and loss and so on. And one of them I call Proxy grief, which is when we experience the death of a loved one, we feel bad enough. And then when you add to it, watching your loved ones cry, and be depressed, and dealing with their own grief, we feel grief on top of that. We feel guilt that we can't fix it. You know, one of the tough groups, as we're going to talk about in a moment, are dads, right? Dads watching their family. And one of the things that dads always say to me, whether it's their spouse died or their child died, is they say, you know, I always thought I could fix things. I mean, I'm the dad, right? And I thought I could protect my family. And then this horrible thing happened to me. And I realized I can't fix this. If a child died, I can't fix my wife. I can't fix my other kids. I can't fix myself. And so, you know, just on top of, you know, grief, then, you know, you feel even more because you feel so helpless. And then there's relief guilt. We know that some families are tormented by, you know, the mental illness of their loved one or the addiction. 6 months ago, I got an email from a woman whose son died of overdose. And I presume you know now that we are, as a nation, dealing with now more than 100,000 overdoses a year. That is more than homicide, which is 20,000 a year, and suicide, which is 50,000 a year combined. And so this mom said, why don't we write a book for parents coping with the guilt of their child who died from mental illness or a drug overdose? And so we're working on it. And by the way, if any of you know someone who's a parent who's experienced that and would be willing to read and comment on the early drafts of the book, they can contact me through my website or through my email. So relief guilt, you know, they say things like, you know, as horrible as this is, I know I won't be getting phone calls at 3 a.m, or police knocking on my door telling me that something terrible has happened. And then benefit guilt. In some cases, there's an insurance settlement, and suddenly you have this money. And then what do you do with this money? You know, do you spend it? Do you pay off your credit card? And, you know, so just the guilt of having some degree of benefit. And then we all know survivor guilt, right? You know, siblings who've experienced the death of a brother or sister, you know, look back and say, you know, why did I live? One of the movies that I mentioned last night that came out 25, 30 years ago that, shows this is called Ordinary People. And raise your hand if you've seen Ordinary People before, right? What a powerful movie, but it shows about a brother, Timothy Hutton, and the mom is Mary Tyler Moore, and the father is, what's his name? I just lost his name. And this whole family is coping with the fact that this teenage boy had died. And so it focused on Timothy Hutton and his guilt that he felt because they were in a boating accident and he survived, okay? And then grief guilt, meaning I'm not grieving right. Years ago when my mother was ill with cancer, I'd been teaching the death class for more than 10 years at that point. And I remember thinking, I wonder how I'm going to grieve. I know a lot about grief now. And I think one of the benefits that I gave to myself was that after my mom died, I remember saying to myself, I'm just going to grieve however am I going to grieve. Okay. But I wrote this article years ago called What If I Grieved Perfectly? Because I've never had, someone come up to me and say, Dr. Bob, I'm grieving just right. I'm crying just the right amount of tears. I have the perfect amount of anger and so on. It's like, no, you grieve how you're going to grieve. And that's one of the frustrating things is, guess what? Other people aren't going to grieve like us. And then another one, of course, is moving on guilt. Because what happens is when your loved one dies, you wake up the next day. And I tell my students in the death class, I say, I know what's going to happen the next time your loved one dies. And you're going to go, what? And the answer is that you're going to wake up the next day. And you're going to say to yourself, I can't believe my loved one died yesterday. And then it's going to be another day and another day. And pretty soon it's going to be a week. My mother died May 24th, 1991. Years ago, when I was in my doctoral program, I did my dissertation on widowhood. And whenever I would ask them, because I asked them hundreds of questions, when did your spouse die? It wasn't, sometime in August in 1980, it was like August 23rd, 3 p.m., 1980, right? So you'd never forget those dates. And so suddenly it was a week after my mom died. It was, May 31st, 1991. I said, Mom died last Friday. It's been a week. And then pretty soon it's a month. June 24th, July 24th, pretty soon 6 months. And you know where I'm going with this. Then it's a year. Then it's 5 years and 10 years. And for me, last May 24th, 30 years ago, my mother died. And the whole idea of, somehow getting over your grief and, it's like, no, in some ways that grief is still there. Not as intense, hopefully, but what we know is that, we love this person and we miss that person. I mean, we want them back. So I wrote an article called, because now it's been 31 years, 1 billion seconds since Mom died, because 31 years is about 1 billion seconds. And so I wrote about the fact that, yes, it gets better, but, grief continues. So moving on, okay? And so the next section here is dealing with suggestions for coping. And so I ask, widowed people and siblings and, parents and grandparents, when you had guilt, how did you cope with it? Okay, everybody, hopefully you can see that. So one is, let's see, is understand that feeling less grief doesn't mean that you're letting go of your loved one. And for one of the things that when I talk about it is that grief gets entangled with the memories of our loved one. And for some people, what begins to happen is as they begin to disentangle the pain and their grief, that they feel like they're losing the memory of the loved one. And so for some people, they hang on. And I have no problem with people hanging on. For example, years ago, I gave a talk at compassionate friends group, and there was a woman that raised her hand and said, there were about 30 people sitting there, all bereaved parents. She said, my daughter died 6 months ago, and I haven't touched her room since. Is that wrong? Because people are telling me I need to, make her bed and start putting things away, make it into a sewing room, And so I knew the answer that the parents were going to give. And I had all the parents, she was sitting in the back, and all the parents turned around, and I said, I want you to tell this woman, this mother, whether it's been too long that since she's touched her child's room. She goes into her room, she lies on the bed, she smells her child's pillow and so on. And it was a very powerful moment when they all turned around and said, no, it's not too long. You decide. You decide. You don't let other people come in and decide when that's going to happen. We kept my mom's clothes hung up in her closet for years after she died. I still have one of my dad's suit coats, one of his shirts, his shoes, his pillow in my closet. And that was from my dad, that was 20 years ago. So another one is to identify self-talk. That is, what do I say to myself about the guilt? And then set a date and say to yourself, I'm going to beat myself up. I'm going to say, if only, why didn't I? I should have, and so on. But go ahead and do that. But pick a date in the future, the birthday of your loved one or the death day of your loved one, a year, 2 years, whatever it is. And then when you wake up on that day, that's the day that you're going to then catch yourself with your self-talk and begin to say and drop those things of I should have, and what's wrong with me, and why wasn't I there, and why didn't I realize this was going to happen, and so on. It doesn't mean that the feelings of guilt can't go away. What it means is, those of you who know about cognitive behavioral therapy, is that you're challenging your own thoughts. Okay. Then next, write a list of all you did right and all you did wrong with that person. Write it out. Talking about it isn't enough. Writing it out is critical. And then group sharing, the power of the organization Compassionate Friends. And, David and Terry, who put on this amazing regional workshop in March, inviting people to come in and listen to speakers and share their ideas. They know so well. And for example, there's more than 700 chapters across the United States that, where people meet and share what's going on. And as you all know, it's powerful stuff. Next, it says there, make a list of all the things you wish you had done differently and underline the good intentions. Then next is what I call the best friend approach, meaning that if our best friend did the same thing that they feel guilty about, what would you say to your best friend? Would you beat your best friend up like you beat yourself up? Most people, no. And so the question I always ask the parents especially is, can you begin to treat yourself as well as you could, as well as you do your best friend? And a lot of people feel like, no, I need to be hard on myself because that's going to make me a better person and so on. It's like, no. Can you relax a little bit and be as gentle and caring to yourself as you could your best friend? Then the spiritual approach, praying to God, praying to spirit, somehow, getting that connection, reading a book that can give you some feelings of comfort and so on. Then next is compiling memories. I tell parents, there's a good chance that some of your child's friends has pictures of your child, but they don't want to send those pictures to you. And here it comes, because they think it's going to remind you of what you lost. So when I ask parents, how many of you would like a phone call, a text, an email, a picture, video, anything of your child who died? And their hands shoot up. And I tell my students in class, if you've experienced the death of a friend when you were growing up, I want you to contact the parents and I want you to tell them a story about that child. And they love it. Next is a chat. This is a very powerful example of what you can use to help someone cope with their guilt. And so here I am in a workshop. I got 100 parents sitting there, all have decided to take a workshop on guilt. And one of the things I say to them is the following. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to imagine that your child is going to say something to you about all the guilt that you've been carrying. Your child's going to come back to you for 10 seconds. And so I'm going to ask you for a moment. I'm going to be silent for 10 seconds. I'm going to ask you to think about or to imagine what your child would say to you. And so right now I'm going to be silent for 10 seconds, just as I do in front of the group. And when I look up at the group, about half of them have tears streaming down their face. And I ask them, turn to someone and tell them what you heard. Tell them what you heard your child say. Even if your child died as a baby, I want you to imagine what that child said to you. And so people often are comforted. And, it's like, listen to your child, because your child wouldn't want you to, have those kinds of feelings. In some cases, for a widowed person, the husband may come, may have said something like, yes, Sylvia, if you had, fed me so much saturated fat, I wouldn't have had that heart attack, right? So what you do is you say to the widowed person, you talk back to Harold, and you tell him, Harold, you tried to control me down here. You're not going to control me from up there. You got it? And then another one is a letter. And for many people, this is a powerful one, right? I want you to sit down, I tell them, and write a letter to the person who died. If you have to say you're sorry, apologize for something, do it. But sit down and start writing, whether it's a pen and paper, whether it's your phone, whether it's a text, whether it's your computer, but sit down and write it out. And then put it away and read it the next day or a week from then or a year from then to see what you said. And you don't have to just write one letter. You can write many. And then one of the mantras that I ask people to always imagine is, what would it take for you to feel less guilty? What would it take? And that's the question I want you to ask yourself as you get up each day. Because we're hard on ourselves, as we talked about the best friend approach. What would it take for you to begin to feel less guilty? And that's the word, begin to feel less guilty. Next, channeling guilt. What can you do to take this energy of guilt, of grief, of loss, of anger and all that and channel it into something positive? I mean, look what, Terry and David did. They took, their grief and they channeled it into something that, has supported hundreds of people. And then next, educate yourself. I told the students last night, you now know more about guilt than most people, right? The types of guilt, suggestions for coping with it. And then last is to appreciate the fact that, we all grieve differently, that, we're all different kinds of people and that we need, and in some cases, you won't see people exhibiting, guilt in the way that, or grief in the way that you do. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here, and men in grief, a tough issue. I was telling Alan and Louisa and the students last night that almost 30 years ago now, we got together 8 men who had experienced all kinds of grief, the death of a spouse, death of a child, death of a brother or sister, death of parent, and so on. And these 8 men then shared their stories about how they as men cope with grief. And so, of course, we know there's many factors that influence how we grieve. One is how our brain is wired. And what do we know? We know that men's brains are somewhat differently wired than women's brains. And then our upbringing, what about crying? Was it okay to cry? What about your culture, your spiritual beliefs, your role in the family, right? So years ago, 2 researchers, Ken Doka and Terry Martin, psychologists, wrote a book about men in grief. And some of you might be familiar with the book. And so I read a couple stories about them last night, but what we know is that our society has different expectations for how women grieve and how men grieve. And if a man grieves too much like a woman, where he's crying and weeping and wailing and tears are streaming down his face, in general, as a society, we have a problem with that, right? And we know that opposite for a woman. If a woman is, toughing it out and, looking like she's cold and not really, responding to this death, what's wrong with her, right? And so, as it says, in the past, the research on grief made the mistake of basing it on a feminine model, okay? All right, and some of you may be familiar with their work on this, something called intuitive grievers versus instrumental grievers. And you can see there's a line here where it, indicates that there's one side and the other, but then there's, combinations of the two. And so an intuitive griever is one then that is in touch with their body and is emoting, right? They're feeling these emotions, they're feeling what's going on, and they have a need to express them and talk about it, right? And as you might guess, that tends to be more females, right? And then instrumental griever are people who feel like they have to do something. They're not so in touch with, what's going on emotionally. And so their grief, ends up as an activity, which we're going to talk about in a moment, okay? And so when we think about the word grief work, one of the ways that I think about grief work means that we are confronting the reality of the death and feeling the pain of the death. And each person has a way of working on their grief work. When my dad died almost 20 years ago, he died on the way to the hospital. He was in a nursing care facility, and they said he was having problems breathing. So they put him in an ambulance, and they said, or 911 vehicle, and they said, we're going to take him to the hospital, meet us there, right? And when we got there, the poor social worker didn't know that we didn't know. And so when she came in the room, because we were waiting, like, where's my dad? And she said, well, as you know, your father passed away. Like, what? What? My sister and I are sitting there in shock, like, what? No, we didn't know. So here we are crying, upset, and so on. The next day I went over to his house, and I went downstairs to get some stuff out of his room. And normally when I walk downstairs to his room, I'll kind of tease him and I'll say, hey, is anybody down here? And he has a little TV in a little living room, and then there's his bedroom. Of course, I didn't say anything. He wasn't there. I went downstairs. I went up to his bedroom, and I stood there looking at his bed and all of his stuff. And I threw myself on the bed, sobbing. And I remember thinking later, I was doing my grief work. I have 4 brothers and sisters. I could have said to them, you go to dad's room. I'm never going there again. So confronting the reality and the pain of grief is this thing called grief work. Yeah. Yeah, when we flew over here from Seattle, my wife's reminding me that we had a death on the plane. And my wife started crying because she was looking at the daughter whose mother just died right in front of her. The woman was, in her 80s, and literally just a few rows back, they were giving her CPR. And so, right, expressing it. So how do intuitive grievers do their grief work? As it says, the person responds to the feelings in their mind and body and prefer to discuss their bodily sensation. One mom said to me years ago, she said, when my daughter died, it felt like a tree had been ripped out of my heart by the roots. I thought, wow, what a way to express it. How do instrumental grievers do theirs? Their grief is primarily driven by thoughts, more of an intellectual experience. They channel their energy into activity. They prefer to discuss the problem rather than the feelings. And again, there are women who grieve, more instrumentally. There are men who grieve more, intuitively. So it's not just, has to be definitely men or women on one side or the other. So of course the caution, as it says there, don't generalize. But as I mentioned earlier, if a man does, too much of intuitive, we see him as a wimp, right? we see him as, what's wrong with him? He can't pull it together. Or if a woman then, is stuffing it inside, then, guess what? There's something wrong with her. At the very top, I'm not sure you can see that very well, but it says, why do people grieve the way they do? Especially why do men have some issues? And so I mentioned to the class last night, as I always do in my workshops, the research on John Gottman. If you don't know that name Gottman, you need to write it down and you need to Google it, because John Gottman is world famous. He and his research team at the University of Washington 30 years ago began to look at how couples argue, right? And what they found was that if couples have 5 factors, the more of these 5 factors of arguing that they have, the more likely they are to get a divorce. And the factors that emerged out of the research, they had couples come into the lab and actually talk to each other about some problem they were having, and they videotaped it. And of course, I asked the class last night to guess, what do you think married couples argue about most? And you know the answer: money, right? And I tell my students, when you marry someone from a different culture, right? I tell the class that I lived in a duplex with 1 bathroom and 5 kids and a mom and dad. My girlfriend, who then is my wife, lived in LA with a swimming pool in her backyard and 1 brother, right? And so already you got a different culture that you're dealing with. And so Gottman found that these 5 factors influenced whether people would get a divorce or not. That is, these 5 factors of how people argue: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, and belligerence. Thanks to Louisa last night for reminding me of that last one. The more of those 5 factors that people had when they argued, the more likely they were to get a divorce. John Gottman's research years ago got to a point where they could look at a couple, the videotape of a couple, and be able to predict 5 years later whether they would be married, still married, or get a divorce. Their research showed that they were able to predict with greater than a 90% accuracy. Then the question is, what about stonewalling? What does that mean, and why do people stonewall? People stonewall because they are in so much pain. They hook people up to physiological indicators. What is stonewall? Stonewall means you leave. You leave psychologically, or you leave physically. Get up and walk out the door because it's too intense for you. When they hook these people up to physiological indicators while they were arguing, what they found was that they measured heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, respiration rate, and they found that for some people their heart rates went from 70 to 90, but for some people it went up to like 115, right? And as I said to the class last night, that more often one group is somewhat more likely to do it than another group. And what is the name of this group that is more likely to stonewall? They are called men. Yes. And what happens is that they are in pain, so they can't deal with it at the moment. And I say, sometimes, moms will say to me, he won't talk about it. My husband can't talk about my daughter. When we start talking about it, or talk about the accident or the overdose or the suicide, he gets up and leaves. What is wrong with him? And so by explaining this research by Gottman, I'm able to say, if you believe what Gottman found, this person's in a lot of pain. So how do you deal with that? You have a timeout, right? And so I'll finish up. Looks like we're ready for at a point in a couple of minutes for questions, to talk about some research by Carol Stoddicker. She wrote many years ago the first book called Men in Grief. And she found that there were 5 styles of how men grieved. One was to remain silent. You see the word emotional insulation. As many of you know, that is a defense mechanism in which you keep your emotions inside. And we demand that. One of the things that, dads would say to me is people would come up and say, I'm sorry about the death of your son, or your daughter. And then they would ask the following question: how's your wife doing? What are they not asking? Right. How are you doing? Because we're kind of afraid to find out how they're doing because they might tell us, or they might start crying or whatever. So it's easier to, right? How's your wife doing? And then a second approach is to engage in solitary mourning, grieving visiting the gravesite and not telling anyone. So it's called secret grief, right? They're grieving, but they're the dad, they're the husband, they're the man, and they're not supposed to show these kinds of things. Then next, to take physical or legal action. Many people have a high need for control. One dad said to me years ago when his son died, he said, for me, Bob, it's easier to be angry than sad. Another, to be immersed in some activity, workaholism. Like, bosses love the fact when, the person is in grief and goes to work and says, yeah, I need to take on more work here. Oh, sure. Well, we'll give you more work. Or taking more risks. Those of you who know Houdini, after his mother died, he was devastated and he took higher risk than he ever had in his career, because that sort of, gave him a way to, deal with his grief. And then, of course, the last is addictive behavior. And so I'm going to pretty much finish up on this. There's a few more things, but by and large, those are some of the important things that I found about men in grief. I'll give you one more book to consider. It's called Swallowed by a Snake, and it's about men's grief. And one of the excellent suggestions that he gives in his book is that rather than asking a man, of course, the famous psychology question, right? How do you feel about that? What you ask that person is, what's going on in your body? You're talking about their grief now, right? How are you dealing with the death of your wife, for example? And you ask them, what's going on inside of your body? What does your stomach feel like right now? My stomach just feels empty. That's my life. Yeah, that's what I'm feeling, empty. I'm walking around going, where is she? She's supposed to be here, right? What does your heart feel like? My heart feels like heavy. So what does that mean? I guess sad. That's it. I'm sad, right? What's going on in your throat? It's tight. What's going on there? I guess I'm fearful. I'm anxious about what's going to happen with my other family members now that this person has died. Got it? So it's, working instead on, asking how you feel, but that sees what's going on in their body. I told the class last night, I remember when I was 21 years old, and I had someone who was leading a class or a workshop, and the woman said, and so you need to pay attention to your gut reaction. And I remember saying to myself as a 21-year-old guy, what the hell does that mean? Gut reaction, right? And I give that example, a very personal one, to show that many guys are like that, right? Getting in touch with feelings, that's some hard work. So let's finish up here and let me open it up to any questions that you have. All right. So think about all this stuff that I flooded you with, and anything that you'd like to ask me about in the last 5, 6, 7 minutes here. And we got the same thing last night, didn't we, Alan, with 15 students, graduate students in social work. But then what it took is one person, and finally there was 5, 6, 7 questions that were asked. So anything that someone wants to bring up? Okay, go ahead and talk.
Okay, yeah, I'm just wondering, as far as like group work and working with folks who are at, experiencing different kinds of guilt, and how you might approach activities or, things that can kind of generalize to a diverse group of experiences within like a group.
What I like is that you just have a list of the types of guilt, and then ask them which ones are resonating with them. Because once you put, as you saw it, once you put a label to it, it's like, Ah, okay, yeah, that's the one for me. And so, some of the TCF chapters have told me that they use my my list, and that just starts sparking the responses. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So, and for those of you who are interested, let's see, let me give you my website. Let's see. Can you see that on there?
We can put it. We can put it in the chat. And actually, it
Oh,
went out
terrific.
with the announcement, Bob.
Yeah, and you're welcome to use any of my information, because for me, like I say, I'm a teacher. I take it in and then I give it away. So use it in any way you like.
You know what we'll do, if it's okay with Marcus and Jeanette, is we'll get the 2 handouts over to them, and people can contact Kukuamau for copies of your handouts if that works for you. Is that okay?
Great.
Okay. Is that okay with you, Marcus and Jeanette? Okay.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
One of the questions that came up is, do I work with widowers? Yes. When I did my dissertation, I interviewed more than 100 widowed people, but only about 20 of them were men. And so I focused my dissertation on women. But over the years, I've interacted with a widowed group in Seattle. There's widowed men as well. One of the things that I think is really important as part that sort of goes above and beyond grief is the fact that when a married woman dies and leaves her husband, to do the things that she used to do. And I got an email from a man, widowed man, a couple of years ago, and he said it was tough enough, losing her and missing her and, not sleeping with her and seeing her, all that goes on with grief. But then he said, I had to sit down and do all these tasks. And he said, it just made me appreciate, 10 times, 100, all the things that she did. And now I have to figure out how to do them, whether it's income taxes or preparing me, all the sort of standard things that you think about. And so, that's a huge issue. One of the big things that comes up, and most of you know this, is that for widowed men, if you're an older man, you look around and now for the first time in your life, there's a lot of women out there. There's a lot of women who might be interested in you, and you're lonely and you're in grief and you're in pain. And so what do? You start dating, right? And so you go on the app, and pretty soon, and what I say to my students, your job is not to judge, except in this case. If dad starts dating and then before a year is up, he decides to get married or have her move in, you say to dad, can you wait a year? Please, dad, can you wait a year? Because what's happening is he's not dealt totally with his grief. No one can deal totally with the grief ever, but let alone in the first year. So men have that tendency. They go and, want to get involved with someone again. You all know that. So anyway, were there a couple other questions that I missed? I saw a couple things in the chat. So if you sent something in the chat and you want to speak up.
Do you want to explain what it is that you shared in the chat?
I just, I'm Pat Nishimoto. I really appreciated your coping suggestion of the chat. During that 10 seconds, it touched me personally, and I realized that's something that is so valuable. I've had families write letters to the person, and I found that very helpful, but the chat was very powerful in a very short amount of time. Yes. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, please use that. But I'm going to say the obvious. Before you launch into it, give them a warning. Say, what I'm going to do next is going to be somewhat emotional, and it's going to last for 10 seconds. But get ready for it. So great. I'm glad it helped.
Doctor, I'm so grateful for you to be here with us today, and thank you for taking time out from your vacation to be with us and to be able to share with us today. And I know that we could have spent, 8 hours instead of just 1 hour with you, and we still wouldn't have gotten to everything. But I really, really appreciate you being here with us and your willingness to share your information. And your website is just amazing. I think everybody who got the announcement out in an email got your website on the email, and it's also on the Kukuamau announcement. But let me see if we can type it into the chat here. www. I'm sorry,
BobBaugher.com. And there are, I think I mentioned, more than 100 articles. Oh, good. Oh, great. And more than 100 articles that I've written on there, and you're welcome to download and use any of them in any way that you like.
Bob has also written several books, and there's also videos there on his website that are very helpful. So thank you all for being here.